Hello, hello. Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Jane. Lovely to see you. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks, Daphne.
Good. Hi, Sarah. Welcome.
Hi, Daphne. Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
I
Uh,
am thrilled. Thank you for having me.
of course. I'll just make a quick note for everyone in the audience that this presentation was accredited by the LSO and has 1 hour of EDI content. So for anyone watching, good to note that. But otherwise, thank you so much, Jane Hutt and Sarah Rutledge Fisher, for being here, and I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Hall. I am a collaborative lawyer and a senior lawyer at Russell Alexander Collaborative Family Lawyers. So I'd like to explain a little bit why I am very interested in this topic and why I want to learn more. I have a child who came out maybe around 6 years ago, and they really asked me to understand them, understand their community. And I have done a lot of research, as well as done a lot of mandatory reading, and I say mandatory because I was provided with a mandatory reading list by my child, and I have been diligent in doing so, but there are still many things that I just don't know. I simply just don't know. I'm a little bit confused sometimes, afraid a little bit about asking questions. So I think that if I'm confused half the time, I think many of us are. Um, so I have invited Sarah here to talk to us a little bit about some of the things, and a lot of it is just basic things. So I'll ask Sarah now to introduce herself to us.
Hi, good morning here in Alabama, and I think good afternoon where many of you are. My name is Sarah Rutledge Fisher. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm happy with either. I am a non-binary lesbian living in the deep, deep south of the United States, and I've spent the last 10 or so years organizing, educating, writing, advocating for and in the the 2S LGBTQI plus community here in the United States. I'm also an attorney licensed in Alabama, here in Alabama, and also in California, where I used to practice. But these days, I primarily work as a mediator and also doing these kind of diversity and inclusion efforts, which are always near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I think that Sarah and I discussed why we're doing this at all. And I think that, it's really important to keep having these conversations. Well, first of all, it's important to have basic cultural competency. But beyond that, to be able to serve our clients in a way that most of us want to, I think it's not just about reading a chapter in a book. I think it's to engage with the conversations that this community that we're serving is having internally as well. So we're aware of certain maybe sensitivity points or things that we may not otherwise know because we're not within that community.
That's such a beautiful point, Jane. I always think that it's good advice when you are working for or with a community that is underrepresented or non-dominant in the culture to turn first to the experience and information available from that community that is being offered. And I know that, Jane, we did want to share with everyone in this presentation today that while we won't be discussing anything incredibly graphic, these are emotional topics, and we don't know what people's personal stories or experiences are. And so if something we're talking about becomes, too emotionally loaded for you, we invite you to step away, turn off the audio for a second, and tend to yourself. This is a self-care and boundary respecting place.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it is important to note that. Okay, so we're going to dive in a little bit, and we want to start off first. Can we have a slide change, please? Slide change, and we want to start off by discussing a little bit of who we're talking about. Who do we mean when we say 2SL LGBTQ community in the first place? I know there are many acronyms that out there. We just don't know, not all of us know what they stand for. And quite frankly, it's a little bit intimidating, like caps, right? So many letters in caps. And I feel, we all recognize caps mean screaming a little bit. And so we're a little bit intimidated by that. So can you explain a little bit to us and where we can find the resources, Sarah?
Absolutely. First of all, if you find it overwhelming or you're confused, you aren't alone. It is an evolving creature. It is something that has continued to grow and evolve as people's understanding of their identity and their ability to describe that identity and find like members of that group has evolved. And in the, I'm going to get the pointing. I don't know which way it is on your screen, but in the slides, we have provided one resource. The rest of the resources we'll be providing after, but I do want to point everyone towards GLAAD, which is an advocacy organization. They have a wonderful reference term page that they keep pretty updated. Because whatever I go over today is not going to be comprehensive today, and it's certainly not going to be comprehensive in 6 months or a year. But real fast, because I don't want to get too long into the details, I want to just quickly acknowledge that most people probably know the LGB and even the T. Most of us know that L stands for lesbian, and that lesbian is a person who identifies as female, who is romantic or sexually attracted to another person who identifies as female. Gay represents, even though the term is often used as a general term, within this acronym, it represents men who are attracted to or romantically or sexually to other men. Bisexual indicates people who are attracted to people of both male and female gender. And transgender is a term, an umbrella term that encapsulates everyone who does not identify their gender as the gender they were assigned at birth. And we'll get a little more into that in a second. But I want to talk about the 2S and the Q. I think many of you may know that the 2S stands for two-spirit, and that is a term that was chosen by, I believe, a council of Native American leaders to represent the broad spectrum of non-heteronormative identities that have existed in the wide variety of different tribes and cultures of the Native American communities. And so sometimes that term is used loosely as LGBTQ, but Native. It's really more expansive than that, and we'll provide a link in our references for anyone who's interested in going down that rabbit hole. And it has been moved to the front of the acronym to acknowledge the way in which Native people have been displaced and suffered an additional burden, especially Native people of the LGBTQ community. And then, well, I'll take a break and let Jane bring me around to the next point.
So sometimes I get a little bit confused, and I'm not alone, about sort of grouping this gender identity and this sexual orientation together, within this community. Is there a difference? Can you explain to us what the difference is?
Yes, let me explain both the term queer, which I left behind when I got a drink of water, and that difference, because the term queer embraces both gender identity and sexual orientation. And a lot of our attendees today may be uncomfortable with the word queer, and that is absolutely fine. For many of us growing up, the word queer was used as a slur. It was used as an insult. But to a large degree, the LGBTQ community has kind of reclaimed the word, and many people enjoy using it because of the way it is a blanket term. I don't have to share with you the specifics of my romantic attraction, my gender identity. I can just let you know that I don't fall within the heteronormative gender or sexuality identity. So that's what the Q stands for. A lot of times in the past, it was thought to stand for questioning, but that's kind of been phased out. People don't generally use it to mean that anymore. But that's not what you asked, Jane. Gender identity and sexual orientation can be so confusing because for much of my life, we conflated the two. We said that if your gender identity was more masculine, then you must be attracted to people who appear more feminine. We confused outward presentation with inward understanding. And we thought that outward presentation was a signal of who a person was attracted to. So we had the traditional, Dick and Jane from the 1950s, girl boy reading books of the man and the boy and the girl. And if you wore feminine clothes, then you were trying to be a girl. And if you wore masculine clothes, you were trying to be a boy. And if you were born and the doctor said, it's a boy, and later you're wearing feminine clothes, then you're transgressing culture. But we still understood it as one thing. These days, we understand that it's not black and white, and it's not even a spectrum. It's more of a smorgasbord that we can, flip over and understand all sorts of different points on. So someone can know that inside themselves, everybody on our call right now knows that deep inside themselves, they have a sense of being female, being male, of not feeling any connection or identity with gender at all, of having a connection that is a combination of those three possibilities, or having an identity that can vary day to day, may feel strongly female one day, strongly male the other day, irrelevant other days. Some of these people may identify that outwardly or may just be an inner experience, but that would be gender identity. It's about who you know yourself to be and how that feels relevant to who you are. But that is not at all relevant to who you want to hold hands with when you're walking down the beach, who you had a crush on when you were in the third grade. And those romantic feelings and physical feelings are what we tend to call sexual orientation. And I tend to use the word romantic attraction and physical attraction more because it is for everyone more than just sex. But that is what we are talking about when we talk about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and some of the others that aren't included in the main acronym.
Okay, so because we're lawyers, we want to get the facts straight. We want to figure out what it is that we're talking about.
Define the terms.
You define the terms. The next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is, again, to foreground this conversation that we want to have today, is a little bit about the history of the legal history of this community, what they have faced. Can I have a slide change, please, Daphne? So in Canada, it's actually only been about 19 years that Civil Marriage Act came into force. So it's really, 19 years ago, I was already an adult and working, and, it's really within our generation. And in Ontario, a couple of years prior, the first gay marriage was performed. And disturbingly enough, I think, in 1969, we saw decriminalization of same-sex sexual activity with the amendments to the criminal code. And in 1995, the Supreme Court held that sexual orientation was analogous to the group of the grounds of discrimination enumerated in the Charter. So again, I just want to sort of describe how recent some of these changes are that have affected the community that we are trying to embrace today. So in 2001, M versus H case established that laws that treated same-sex couples differently from heterosexual couples were unconstitutional, which was a significant change for support issues that we deal with in family law. And in as recently as 2017, the Canadian government started issuing passports with female, male, or X gender categories. And because Canada was one of the first countries to embrace equal marriage, we also became one of the first to consider the particular challenges associated with the need to divorce. So, until 2005, the Divorce Act had defined spouses as a man or a woman. Therefore, people who were able to get married couldn't seek divorce until then, until there were amendments made to the Act to define spouses in a way that we are now seeing today. And again, these changes are very recent in the US as well. So I'm going to ask Sarah to describe some of the changes.
Yes, here in the US, I'm a little jealous of, even though it seems so recent, these changes have been much more recent in the US. For example, I think you said decriminalization of same-sex activity, while one of the first states in the United States decriminalized same-sex activity in the 1960s. It wasn't until 2003 when the Supreme Court struck down Texas's laws in Lawrence v. Texas that same-sex sexual activity was decriminalized for the entire nation. And similarly, it wasn't until 2015, which I'm sure many people remember, when the Obergefell v. Hodges decision established that same-sex marriage was a fundamental right.
Okay, so again, we're talking about a community that has recently undergone changes that have allowed them to feel accepted, allowed them to feel part of the greater community. And there's a sense of harm that comes from that, from having felt marginalized, having felt not within the dominant culture. I know this anecdotally, obviously not as a personal experience. So I'm going to ask Sarah again to share, not necessarily all your personal details, but from a little bit of a different perspective than I might have. Can I have a slide change, please?
Absolutely. No trauma dumping in this presentation, but being in a group that is outside the cultural norm can impose harm on any community, and the LGBTQ community is no exception. And even though we think 2003 and 1969, those changes are so established, we want to be able to just move on and act as if everything is normal now. That isn't necessarily the way our LGBTQ clients are and have experienced their life. So I know that a lot of times when people are talking about the divorce or separation of a couple, we use the example that, one of this may have been the marriage that one of the spouses has been dreaming about since they were a little girl. Well, when you're working with LGBTQ couples, when they were little people, little girls, boys, children, they were not allowed to dream of their future. Their future was not visible. There were no examples of that dream. And so that comes with a harm that sticks around. There's a hidden harm that can come to not belonging to the dominant group. So, and all of these harms have accumulated over someone's lifetime. So if we have a client who is in their 40s or 50s, and they've been married 10, 20 years, depending on where they live, we may think, okay, no big deal. They've been married, it's been established. They're not suffering the harm of our culture not allowing marriage for LGBTQ folks. But these are also people who were in their formative years during the AIDS crisis, who were alive when women were regularly institutionalized for same-sex sexual activity, at least here in the US. I was telling Jane while we were preparing for this presentation that I remember in the 90s hearing of gay men during the AIDS crisis who would adopt one another, that one of the men in a couple would adopt the other man in the couple because it was the only way for them to ensure that they had medical access should one of them get sick, that they had rights of inheritance, rights of decision making. And those are really hard stories to hear, especially for those of us who pass our day to day in the dominant culture. And, you know, even though I'm a blue-haired lesbian, non-binary person, I lived most of my life passing pretty well in dominant culture and not experiencing that harm, but it is still inside of me, that knowledge that those extreme measures had to be taken. So your clients are coming in with those wounds that they've been walking around with, even if they're not something that you see or that you've experienced.
Or they may not even acknowledge, right? I mean, not in a way that we can respond to. I think the
That's
reason
right.
why, I think it's important again to have these conversations is just to be a little bit aware of the possibilities of, the kind of sense of shame that you're describing that they're walking around with that they themselves may not be aware of, certainly not acknowledging to you.
Right. Shame is a really big issue for all of us, in my opinion, but certainly within the LGBTQ community, because many LGBTQ adults, in fact, some would say most LGBTQ adults did not grow up in families or communities or institutions that were embracing or even tolerant of who they were. And so that experience of being shamed by culture, shamed by family, and shamed by community may be something that they're no longer dealing with because they have found a new culture, they have found a new community, they've formed new families. But that impact is still there. And it can often lead to internalized shame, which doesn't always show up the way we think it does. And it can create real pain and complications in gender roles, even within same-sex relationships, hierarchies within LGBTQ communities that are based on heteronormative, hyper-traditional gender role ideas. And it can really create some harm and some pain.
Yeah, and when we talked before, Sarah, you talked a little bit about how they present as opposed to, what they are masking inside, that some of it being a sense of shame, but there's also a sense of anxiety, right? That
Yes.
hope that they can actually let their guard down. There's a sense of anxiety that always plagues one when one has these kind of deep-rooted emotional feelings.
Yes, I think we did talk a lot about masking, and I think that idea of needing to put on a mask is something that everyone has experienced, but isn't something we talk about a lot. And it's something that affects non-dominant cultures and the LGBTQ community quite a bit to varying degrees from person to person. So if someone feels at home within a community of others like them and they fear that they might be not welcomed or treated with some harm in community in the dominant culture, then it's pretty typical for people to adopt a mask of behaviors that make them feel more safe, less threatened by potential harm in the dominant culture. And I think the example I used with Jane the other day was that, you know, as female presenting people, as women, we are used to the idea that if we're walking home late at night in an urban environment by ourselves, there's a heightened sense of awareness of threat. And there's also a need to portray a certain amount of confidence, a certain amount of ability, and a certain amount of support. So we might walk quickly with our shoulders back and talking on the phone so that any potential attacker knows that we are not going to be an easy target, and that somebody is paying attention to who we are. And I think that the non-female members of the audience can probably also identify with a moment when they had to put on an identity, to project an identity to make sure they felt safe. Well, someone in the LGBTQ community who feels like they might be at a disadvantage when they are in a very traditional environment or an environment with an unknown group of people, or an environment where they feel ill at ease, like a courtroom or a professional office or a doctor's office, anywhere where there is status involved, where there is that fear of the unknown specialized area. For me, it can be even going to the grocery store if it's crowded and there's more of a certain demographic present than others. And it doesn't mean that that person is going to, you know, put on an entirely different personality, but they might make sure that none of their facial expressions are very vivid. They want to fade into the background. They want to appear just like everyone else and not draw anyone's attention. And the reason we need to be aware of that and be mindful of it is because it costs a lot of energy. It's very hard. As anyone who has walked home late at night with all of those guards and presentations up knows that at the end of that experience, you get home and you're, oh, thank goodness I'm home. That was so stressful. I'm so relieved. I feel exhausted. Well, when a person in the LGBTQ community is in an environment where they feel like they need to mask, it is more exhausting than it is for a person who doesn't feel the need to mask in that environment.
Thank you, Sarah. Gives me again things to think about while I am, having a dialogue with my clients. I want to sort of draw the line, though, of understanding a community and then also describing that community in sort of that othering kind of way. I'm always very conscious of this othering kind of thing that we do sometimes, and sometimes I hear it, well, those people, this and that I have experienced somewhat racially, so I can relate to it somewhat. So I just want to talk a little bit about being very careful or very mindful that that's not what we are intending to do.
Yes, the best of intentions, right? And othering or noticing your own tendency to other, and policing that and kind of finding a new way to connect and relate is one of the best ways that you can non-verbally communicate to your LGBTQ clients that they are safe to let down those masks. So when we talk about othering, we literally mean just treating someone as the other. Our little group, our understanding of the world is the norm, and this person is part of the other. So, if we say, oh, this person's coming in and they are a trans individual, so everything is going to come from this lens of exactly how I treat trans people because they are not like normal people, they are other. That can be really harmful, even from the best intentions. And the best example is oh, sorry, I was thinking of something else, but that it can be really harmful. It can really communicate a lack of connection, of understanding, and of empathy. So when we are thinking about and understanding the LGBTQ community from a standpoint of wanting to serve our clients, we aren't wanting to serve them because they are something other than our clients. They are just like everyone else. They are just facing different issues and having similar pains, similar hopes, similar fears in different ways. And so I think the opposite of othering, I was reading in one of the resources I think we provide is belonging. And so the more you can connect to the idea of helping focus on the way someone belongs, not the way they're normal, not the way they're just like everyone else, but the way they belong here as much as anyone else, the more you avoid that accidental othering of someone that doesn't look or sound or present or live the way you do.
Right. Like most things in life, it's a question of balance that you're going to strike with the information that you have. I think there is um, there is a particular kind of way that the community has developed, though. Especially when we talk about marriage and divorce. You talked a little bit about sort of dreaming outside the dominant culture, having dreams that didn't quite fit into that culture, and that does carry forward, right? Um, so I think that you and I talked about then what does that mean for them when they are faced with, failure of marriage, which I wouldn't call it a failure, but many people do look upon it as a failure, and how acute that sense of failure is something that I actually didn't realize before I spoke with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Some of the things that you've talked to me about.
Absolutely. So, when we absorb these stories from childhood, when we're told from childhood that the people we want to love, that the experience of loving someone of the same gender, the experience of identifying differently as the gender the doctor assigned at birth, that makes you an abomination, or that any relationship that follows that model is doomed to fail, or not a valid relationship. Even though we might fight against those ideas, we might push back, we might reclaim our own understanding of self and our own understanding of identity and culture. It's hard to completely erase those voices, those echoes within us. And so that can lead to some of those internalized homophobias, internalized gender phobias that we talked about earlier. And the result of that can come out a lot of different ways in LGBTQ marriage and divorce. I think on the slide we're on currently, there's the final note about the higher incidence of intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community, which is really unfortunate. The data on any intimate partner violence is always less full than we would like it to be. But in general, within the LGBTQ relationships, there is a higher instance of intimate partner violence. One of the reasons for that is that if you are an LGBTQ teenager and you're sitting in your school sex education class where they're teaching you about heterosexual reproduction, they're teaching you about STDs from a heteronormative standpoint. They're teaching you about everything that's coming up presumes heterosexual attraction and orientation. And what happens is a lot of teenagers will just tune all of it out. So when they get to the point of talking through red flags in relationships, emotional relationship ideals, the lessons that we try to teach our youth so that they will be informed and aware and hopefully notice red flags for intimate partner violence before it occurs. A lot of times these teens aren't getting that information because everything we've fed them is so irrelevant to their experience already and their future already, that why would they be listening to that part? So that can be one really harmful outcome of that difference between cultural norms and the way that these ideas can linger from childhood and youth.
So can we even suggest that when we do our IPV screening, as we all do in our practices, we pay particular attention? It's not a foregone conclusion that it's going to be present in a relationship in this community necessarily, but is that something that you might recommend, Sarah?
Absolutely. And also there are some cultural assumptions that can work against our usual awareness and screening for intimate partner violence. Until maybe the last 10 years, there was this cultural idea that in a relationship between two women, there could not be intimate partner violence because women weren't violent, or because one woman couldn't be controlling of another. There can also be a cultural norm that in a relationship between two men, some physical roughness is just par for the course. And, far be it from me to speak to everyone's relationship and what is consensual within a relationship. But there are certainly many people whose experiences were denied because they were told that's what you signed up for, or that can't really be true. The same way that in the past, men were often seen it not to be a possible victim. So that can show up as well. So when screening, I think just notice your own biases and try to pay attention with a real clear head.
Okay. Again, as Sarah mentioned, we don't have clear data on this. This is what we have been noticing in the resources that we've looked at. But there are differences also in a very positive light within queer culture and marriage, right?
Yes. Okay, so are we skipping? Sorry, I got lost in our presentation. Yes.
No, because we were so engaged in our own.
I know. I get really excited about this stuff. So thanks for giving me a second to catch up, everyone. Yes, this is the great news. This is the silver lining. So the thing is, we've been talking about all of the hard, the way that the LGBTQ community a lot of our LGBTQ clients have come to us having experienced a lot of hard things, and that can result in some trauma and some pain that we may not otherwise be presuming. But the upside of this is that the LGBTQ community has been so creative and compassionate that they have really developed some wonderful cultural norms that can really benefit our clients and really benefit us as we begun to learn from them. So the LGBTQ community has a very, very strong and long history of chosen families. And many of you may have heard a lot about the idea of chosen families. And of course, like many of the best things, it has sad origins. Many LGBTQ people have very strong chosen family networks because their families of origin were not accepting or had kicked them out. But what that means is that as opposed to happens normally with our heteronormative clients, when our LGBTQ clients come in, they may have a stronger network of support around them. And they may have someone who is a best friend or an ex or a neighbor or a former roommate that has the same kind of support and closeness and love and compassion that we might think of from a sibling or a parent. And so it's really wonderful. I hope you get to experience some of those relationships and how supportive and powerful they can be. The other silver lining is that a lot of our LGBTQ clients have gone through some of the hardest conversations they might ever have in their lives. I'll paraphrase it to make it a little more palatable for a business environment, but there's an LGBTQ columnist, Dan Savage, who started the It Gets Better project. And he liked to say, when you've sat down with your mother and had a conversation where you tell her that you are romantically attracted to someone of the same sex, there is no conversation you can't have. And now as our culture changes, there are LGBTQ teenagers who have not been through those hard conversations because their families are so supportive and embracing, like Jane. But for some of the older LGBTQ adults, even those with accepting families, most of them have already gone through these really hard conversations. And so they're a little more capable of navigating some of the hard conversations that inevitably come with transitions and marriage, with custody conversations. And so that can be really inspiring to see the flexibility.
Yeah, so which makes it obvious that they're very predisposed to collaboration and mediation practices that you and I have. And I do find that they're ready, they're prepared to have these discussions. I don't have to convince them that it's worthwhile. I don't have to convince them that there is light at the end of that tunnel.
That's right.
Right. The other thing I see in my clients is that there is this insistence on co-parenting, and sometimes that co-parenting involves multiple parents, right?
Absolutely.
Children from exes, and they don't want to leave them out. So then we have these multiple parenting schedules that we have to combine. But for this community, it's an important sense of belonging that they have to share with their community, their chosen family, as you described.
Yes. And certainly what we are talking about doesn't apply to every single person, but it is more present in the LGBTQ community to be able to freely navigate non-traditional family structures. There's less of an expectation of failure if the family doesn't look like, the mom, the dad, the 2.4 kids, and the dog, and the 2 cars in the garage. You might already have a more non-traditional family structure. I just had dinner last week with one of my dearest friends and his partner, and they had spent the day out on a boat with the lesbian couple for whom one of them had been the donor for their children. And so he has had a kind of an uncle kind of role in their lives because they wanted him to stay involved. And the children know that he is their biological dad. They have a really close relationship. He's the default caregiver. They spend a lot of time together as an extended family. His parents have a extended family, almost grandparent-like relationship with the children. And it is just the most beautiful example of the fact that there is no limit to the capacity of love. And so I think because within the LGBTQ community, there are so many more examples around us in our community of non-traditional family structures, I think it's just less of a hurdle to overcome in the co-parenting, divorce, custody conversation.
Okay, so I think it's almost time to wrap up. I want to talk about,
Oh,
I know it always flies by when I'm talking to you, Sarah. So I want to talk a little bit about creating on a practical basis a safe space for our clients.
absolutely.
Yeah, so I want to talk about maybe infrastructure that physical infrastructure, and then maybe other things that we could do, we could implement in our practices.
Yes. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because we did provide some excellent resources in our resource sheet that I think everyone will get after. Um, the first thing everyone thinks about when providing a safe space for LGBTQ folks is unisex bathrooms. Okay, of course, right? Which is not something everyone has the ability to do. But if you are designing your own space or you have access to unisex bathrooms, even if you are offering them to people whose gender identity you think you know, offering that unisex bathroom is a way of communicating, I have respect for your gender identity. My office environment respects your gender identity as you understand it, and we're not interested in imposing our impressions on you. And so that's always really helpful. We also talked a little bit about updating office forms, and this is the worst because we have so many forms and we forget about forms, we forget about documents that may have slipped through the cracks. So I was telling Jane, I thought this was a great task for that summer clerk, that summer associate, to just send them through each form, each standard document, looking not only for pronouns, but for titles, Ms., Mr. There's a gender inclusive title that some non-binary people use, which is MX. And then just adding an other option for anything that's gendered is a great way to be inclusive without having to know what the latest favored jargon is or be worried that the latest favored salutation might change. Not assuming husband and wife, changing your documents to say spouse one, spouse two. And then, asking for people's pronouns, adding a space in that form for pronouns for preferred name, and always leaving that other option there so that they can self-determine if needed.
And then beyond the forms or offices, I know that we mentioned here in the slide thinking to give clients a heads up, just because sometimes we can't control the documents that, you
Right.
know, uh, that come from our court or some kind of
Yeah,
third party, right? To communicate that we are aware, and to communicate to our clients that that we are sensitive to their sense of wanting to feel embraced,
that's right. Right.
their
If you have a document that comes from the court or from another firm or from a vendor you're using and you know that that document, or you suspect that document may not be up to date, then just letting your client know, I don't have control over this form, and I'm pretty sure that it may assume heteronormative gender, or it may say husband and wife instead of spouse and spouse. It doesn't change the form, but when they go to fill that form out, instead of just feeling that negative, icky feeling of this world, has erased me, they also have that supported, embracing feeling of this world has erased me, but my attorney sees me and my attorney has my back.
Exactly. Also training our staff. I mean,
Yeah.
it's great for us to be involved in this, but I know at my firm, there's the intake team, there's the accounting team, there are many other people. So we have continued internal dialogues about how we serve all our clients, but, LGBTQ community.
Absolutely. In fact, if your office has a receptionist or a paralegal or an assistant that is at the front of the office where people enter, that person is going to probably have the biggest burden of making the first impression for your LGBTQ clients. They're the person who is going to be asked, where are the bathrooms? And if I come in and that person says, okay, she's presenting as female, I'm going to tell her where the women's restroom is and not give her the rest of the information, it's probably not going to offend me, because I usually use the women's restroom unless there's something really wrong. But if that person says, it's so nice to see you, Sarah, there's a women's restroom here, there's a men's restroom here, and we have a unisex restroom down this hall, what they've done is communicate to me that they are a gender inclusive space. And so even if it might not apply to me, I know that it just communicates that they're safe, that they're not othering me.
Yeah, and I just want to talk or touch on this pronoun habit. So I think new habits can be learned. Lord knows I make a lot of mistakes, even though I'm always trying. And I feel very, very badly when I make those mistakes, but I do keep trying. And I think it's important to communicate that we're trying, right?
Absolutely. You don't want to make it all about you, but you do want to communicate that you're trying. And everyone makes mistakes. Everyone adjusting to something new makes mistakes. And what's more important than getting the pronouns right is trying to get the pronouns right. And if you get it wrong, that's not that important. If you say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I said she and I meant they, and then just move on. Don't have the person then have to spend their time and energy consoling you and making sure you feel okay. Just own up that it was a mistake, and you're so happy to support them by getting their pronouns right. When you can, people appreciate effort. And if you do happen to run across someone that, just has a big reaction to being misgendered or having a wrong pronoun used, remember that it's not about you. It's not about your one really unintentioned mistake. It's about the 27 other people that week who maybe did something intentionally. And so you just giving them a little grace can go a long way.
Okay, thanks so much, Sarah, for all of that. We are running out of time, and as we mentioned in the beginning, we will be providing you with resources for anyone who is interested in doing a little more reading. Talking about it, you can always reach out to Sarah or me, and in the resources that we provide to you, you'll have our contact information again. So I encourage you to.
If we have just a minute, someone dropped a question in our Q&A that I think we can just answer really fast. which is about the term queer. So this question's been sitting here for the whole presentation. I apologize. And it's just someone asking if, as a cisgendered hetero person, it would be appropriate for them to use the term queer. And I think that it's really a question. It's really a matter of reading the room. If I were representing someone in a legal situation and I didn't know them and I hadn't heard them use the term, I probably wouldn't use it with them. If you're working with someone who does use the term queer, I use the term queer, I identify myself as queer quite a bit, then I think it's a matter of knowing your own comfort. There's no need to try to adopt that term if it doesn't feel natural coming out of your mouth. And if it does, then you can always just check with the person. You know, that's never a bad thing, is to have curiosity and compassion, and just stay in communication about these things.
I think we don't have time to address the other questions, but again, I invite you to please reach out to us. We're happy to provide you with, I don't know, fodder for thought, if nothing else. But thank you again for being with us. Thank you, Sarah, for having this conversation with me.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Jane, for inviting me to be part of this.
What a great presentation, Sarah and Jane. Thank you so much. So informative. Housekeeping matters, but thank you guys. We're just going to do quick housekeeping update, and then it's going to be lunchtime, right?
Yes, that's right.
All right. And welcome back, Shannon.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Sarah and Jane, for that very important discussion. It was very, very insightful and moving. So we really appreciate that. And also thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in and your commitment to learning on this topic. Really appreciate it.